The Baltic Sea, January 30th, 1945. The temperature hovered around at negative 18 degrees Celsius. The water was a black, churning mass of ice and death. And somewhere in that frozen darkness, over 9,000 souls were about to face the most horrific maritime disaster in human history. This is the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, a story that has been largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by the more famous tragedy of the Titanic. But what happened on that frigid winter night was far worse than anything that occurred in the Atlantic 33 years earlier. This is a story of war, desperation, and the terrible price of survival. The Wilhelm Gustloff was born in 1937, not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of peace and prosperity. Named after a Nazi party leader assassinated in Switzerland, the ship was built as a cruise liner for the USS. Kraft durch Freude programmed strength through joy. Nazi initiative designed to show the German working class the wonders of their new Reich. At over 200 meters long and weighing 25,000 tons, she was magnificent. White-hulled and elegant, she offered swimming pools, ballrooms, and sun decks. Before the war, she carried thousands of happy vacationers to the Norwegian fjords and the Mediterranean. She was a floating palace, a promise of better times. But when war came in 1939, everything changed. The Wilhelm Gustloff was painted battleship gray. Her swimming pools were drained. Her elegant staterooms were converted into cramped quarters. She became a hospital ship that a floating barracks for Nazi U-boat trainees anchored in the Baltic port of Gdynia, then known by its German name, Gotenhafen. For years, she sat there, static and gray, her glory days a distant memory. The young submariners who trained aboard her probably never imagined that this ship would become their tomb. By January 1945, Nazi Germany was dying. The 1,000-year Reich that Hitler had promised was collapsing after just 12 years. The Eastern Front was crumbling. The Soviet Red Army, burning with vengeance for the 27 million Soviet citizens killed during the German invasion, was pushing westward with unstoppable force. East Prussia, the isolated German territory on the Baltic coast, was being overrun. Cities that had been German for centuries were falling one by one. Königsberg, Danzig, Elbing ancient Prussian strongholds were now in the path of Soviet tanks and artillery, and the civilian population was terrified. Stories of Soviet atrocities, whether propaganda or truth, spread like wildfire through the refugee columns. Tales of mass rape, murder, and destruction drove millions of German civilians into panic. They had one thought, one desperate goal: escape to the west before the Red Army arrived. The only way out was by sea. Operation Hannibal, named after the Carthaginian general who evacuated his army from Italy, was the largest maritime evacuation in history. Over 2 million German civilians and soldiers would be transported across the Baltic Sea to the relative safety of German-held ports in the west. Hundreds of ships, from ocean liners to fishing boats, participated in this desperate exodus. The Wilhelm Gustloff, mothballed and forgotten for years, was about to be pressed into service for one final fateful voyage. The port of Gotenhafen was chaos. Absolute, desperate chaos. Imagine, if you can, a freezing winter day in January 1945, the temperature far below zero, the docks packed with tens of thousands of refugees, all desperate to board any ship that might carry them to safety. Women clutching babies wrapped in whatever blankets they could find. Children crying, their faces raw from the bitter cold. Elderly people collapsing from exhaustion, having walked for days or weeks to reach the coast. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar of voices, crying, shouting, pleading. German soldiers tried to maintain order, but order was impossible. This was primal desperation. This was survival. The Wilhelm Gustloff was berthed at the dock, and word had spread that she would sail soon. People pushed, shoved, fought to get aboard. Mothers held their children above their heads, passing them to strangers on the ship, hoping they'd make it even if they themselves didn't. Some people had tickets. Most didn't. It didn't matter. The ship's capacity was listed at around 1,800 passengers in peacetime. But these weren't peacetime conditions. Captain Friedrich Petersen, an old merchant marine officer who had been brought out of retirement to command this voyage, watched in horror as more and more people flooded aboard. He protested, he argued. He knew the ship couldn't safely carry this many souls. But his objections were overruled by higher authorities. Every space that could fit a human body was packed. The promenade decks, the dining rooms, the former swimming pool, all filled with refugees. Alongside the civilian refugees came other passengers. 400 young submariners, fresh from training, needed transport to join U-boat crews in the West. 370 female naval auxiliaries, support staff for the Kriegsmarine. Around 160 wounded soldiers carried aboard on stretchers, and about 1,000 naval personnel to crew the ship. In total, estimates suggest that over 10,000 people were packed aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff when she finally prepared to depart. The exact number will never be known because proper manifests weren't kept in the chaos. 10,000 people on a ship designed for less than 2,000. Among them was a pregnant woman named Eva Dorn, traveling with her young son. There was Irene Chinker, just 19 years old, one of the naval auxiliaries. There were countless children, some separated from their parents in the chaos, alone and terrified. Their names, most of them, are lost to history. But they were real. They had lives, dreams, fears. And they were all aboard when the Wilhelm Gustloff finally cast off her lines on the afternoon of January 30th, 1945. The ship's departure was delayed several times. First, a minesweeper escort that was supposed to accompany them had mechanical problems. Then the weather worsened. Captain Petersen wanted to wait, but the port was under increasing threat from Soviet advances. They had to leave. Finally, around 12:30 p.m., the Wilhelm Gustloff began to move, accompanied by the torpedo boat, Lowe, and another smaller vessel. As the ship pulled away from Gotenhafen, many refugees wept with relief. They had made it. They were safe. The frozen hell of the Eastern Front was behind them. Soon they would be in Kiel or Flensburg, in the western part of Germany, far from the Red Army. But safety was an illusion. As the Gustloff headed into the Baltic, Captain Petersen faced a series of terrible decisions. The ship's top speed was normally 15 knots, but her engines hadn't been properly maintained during her years as a barracks ship. She could barely manage 12 knots, and with the sea conditions worsening, even that was difficult. Then came the question of routing. Two paths lay before him. The shallow coastal route, closer to land, was safer from submarines because the water was too shallow for U-boats to operate effectively. But German naval intelligence warned that this route had been heavily mined by Soviet aircraft. One mine could sink the ship. The alternative was the deep water route, farther from shore. It was free from mines, but the deep water made it perfect hunting ground for Soviet submarines. Petersen consulted with Wilhelm Zahn, a submarine commander who was also aboard, traveling as a passenger. Zahn argued for the deep water route. His reasoning was that Soviet submarines rarely operated in winter due to the harsh conditions and ice. The mine threat seemed more immediate. It was a gamble, and they chose wrong. The Wilhelm Gustloff turned north into the deep water. Captain Petersen made one more decision that would prove catastrophic. Normally, ships traveled without lights in wartime to avoid being spotted by enemy aircraft or submarines. But another German convoy was approaching from the opposite direction, and there was a risk of collision in the darkness. So Petersen ordered the ship's navigation lights turned on. In the black January night, the Wilhelm Gustloff became a beacon, visible for miles. Somewhere beneath the black waters of the Baltic, Soviet submarine S-13 was prowling. Her commander was Captain Alexander Marinesko, a 32-year-old Ukrainian who had a complicated relationship with the Soviet Navy. Brilliant, but rebellious. Marinesko was an exceptional submarine commander, but also a heavy drinker who frequently clashed with his superiors. Just weeks earlier, he had disappeared on a drinking binge while his submarine was supposed to be on patrol. He returned to find himself facing court-martial and possible execution. But Marinesko was given one final chance. Take S-13 out on patrol. Sink enemy ships. Redeem yourself or face the consequences. For days, S-13 had hunted in the Baltic with no success. Marinesko was running out of time. His crew was exhausted. Fuel was running low. And then, on the evening of January 30th, his sonar operator reported something. Propeller sounds. A large ship, moving at moderate speed. Marinesko raised the periscope. And there, impossibly, was a massive ship with her lights on, sailing directly toward his position. He couldn't believe his luck. A target like this, in wartime, with lights blazing, it was a gift. He ordered S-13 into attack position. The Soviet submarine commander didn't know what ship this was. He didn't know that over 10,000 refugees, mostly women and children, were packed into her hull. All he knew was that this was an enemy vessel in wartime, a legitimate military target sailing from a German military port. But there's a bitter irony here. The Wilhelm Gustloff was technically a legitimate target under international law. She was painted military gray. She carried armed soldiers and naval personnel. She wasn't marked as a hospital ship or refugee vessel. By the laws of war, Marinesco was justified in attacking her. But justification and morality are not always the same thing. At approximately 9:08 p.m., most of the passengers aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff were trying to settle in for the night. In the former swimming pool, now drained and packed with refugees, mothers were attempting to get their children to sleep. In the corridors, people sat shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in whatever they had for warmth. The ship's heating system couldn't cope with the overcrowding, and many areas were bitterly cold. Some of the young naval auxiliaries were in their quarters, singing songs to keep their spirits up. Down in the bowels of the ship, the wounded soldiers lay in their makeshift hospital spaces. And on the decks, despite the freezing temperature, some people stood outside, preferring the cold, fresh air to the suffocating crush below. The sea was rough. The Gustloff rolled in the heavy swells. Many passengers were already seasick, but they were moving away from the war. Every nautical mile was a mile closer to safety. Then everything ended. The first torpedo struck the forward section of the ship, right where the crew quarters were located. The explosion was massive, a thunderous blast that shook the entire vessel. Instantly, 2,000 submariners who had been sleeping in that section were killed. The watertight doors that should have contained the flooding had been left open because of the overcrowding people needed to move between compartments. 10 seconds later, the second torpedo hit amidships, directly below the former swimming pool. The pool, packed with hundreds of women and children, became a tomb in seconds. The explosion tore through the ship's hull and erupted upward. Bodies were thrown into the air. The lights went out, and freezing seawater began flooding in with tremendous force. The third torpedo struck the engine room. The engines died immediately. The ship's power failed. Emergency lighting flickered on in some areas, but most of the ship was plunged into absolute darkness. And the Wilhelm Gustloff, without power, began to list tilting to one side as water rushed into her wounded hull. In less than a minute, a floating city had become a death trap. Imagine being deep inside that ship when the torpedoes hit. Imagine the absolute terror. The lights go out. You're in complete darkness, packed so tightly with other people that you can barely move. The floor beneath you suddenly tilts at a crazy angle. You hear screaming thousands of voices screaming at once. The sound of rushing water somewhere nearby. The groan and shriek of metal tearing. And you're trying to get out, trying to reach a stairway or a door, but you can't see. And people are pushing in every direction, and the ship keeps tilting further and further. Many passengers were trapped immediately. The explosion blocked corridors, jammed doors shut, collapsed staircases. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, drowned in the first few minutes as water flooded the lower decks. They died in darkness, in spaces that became underwater coffins. Those who could move tried to reach the upper decks and the lifeboats. But the ship was listing so severely, now tilted at such an extreme angle that walking was nearly impossible. People climbed over seats, over railings, over each other. In the chaos and darkness, people were trampled. Children were separated from their parents. The elderly and injured had no chance, and it was cold, unimaginably cold. The temperature outside was 18 degrees below 0 Celsius. The water temperature was perhaps 1 or 2 degrees above freezing. Anyone who fell into that water had minutes at best before hypothermia shut down their body. The ship's crew tried to launch lifeboats, but the severe list made it nearly impossible. Lifeboats on the lower side of the ship were underwater or hanging uselessly against the hull. Lifeboats on the higher side couldn't be lowered properly. They swung out over empty air as the ship tilted. Many boats that were launched successfully capsized immediately in the rough seas, or were so overloaded that they sank within minutes. Some of the young naval personnel managed to cut loose life rafts and throw them into the water, but in the darkness and chaos, many of the rafts drifted away empty, while people who needed them drowned within sight of salvation. Captain Peterson and his officers knew the ship was doomed. The question was only how long they had. 10 minutes? 20? They tried to send distress signals, but the main radio was dead. An emergency radio finally managed to send a message, but would rescue ships arrive in time? As the minutes passed, the list grew worse. The Wilhelm Gustloff was rolling onto her side like a dying whale. The people still aboard were sliding across tilted decks, grabbing desperately at railings, at ropes, at anything that might keep them from plunging into the water. Some people made impossible choices. Mothers threw their babies overboard, hoping someone in a lifeboat might save them, knowing that keeping them aboard was certain death. Men gave up their places in lifeboats to women and children and walked calmly back into the sinking ship to die. And some people, facing the choice between drowning inside the ship or freezing in the water, chose to jump. Hundreds of people leaped from the tilting decks into the black water below. Some hit the water and survived, at least briefly. Others struck debris or the ship's hull and died instantly. And once in the water, they had perhaps 15 minutes before the cold took them. Most had less. 45 minutes after the torpedoes struck, the Wilhelm Gustloff was on her side. Her funnels were touching the water. Her massive hull, once white and proud, now gray and dying, was silhouetted against the night sky. People still clung to the railings, to the side of the ship that now faced upward. They stood on the hull itself, as if the ship were an island slowly sinking into the sea. But there was nowhere left to go. The lifeboats were gone. The water was filled with debris, with bodies, with people screaming for help that wouldn't come. And then she went under. With a tremendous groan of tearing metal and escaping air, the Wilhelm Gustloff made her final plunge. Her bow pointed toward the sky for a moment, as if in one last salute or prayer, and then she slid beneath the black waves. The suction from her sinking pulled hundreds of people under with her. Those who had been clinging to the hull were dragged down into the depths. The roar of the ship's death was followed by a terrible sound, the screaming of thousands of people now in the freezing water, most of them knowing they had only minutes to live. The Baltic Sea in that spot was about 40 meters deep. The Wilhelm Gustloff settled on the bottom, her hull broken, her interior spaces flooded, still packed with the bodies of thousands who never made it out. A tomb beneath the waves. Above, in the oil-slicked water, among the debris and the bodies, perhaps 2,000 people were still alive, clinging to wreckage, floating in life vests, sitting in the few overcrowded lifeboats that had survived, and they were freezing to death. The human body can survive about 15 to 30 minutes in water that cold before hypothermia shuts down the heart and lungs. Some people lasted longer, clinging to hope and life with desperate strength, but most didn't. One by one, the voices crying for help grew quieter. One by one, the struggling figures in the water stopped moving. Children died in their mother's arms. Husbands and wives froze while holding each other, and the bodies drifted in the current, a vast field of the dead spreading across the black water. The torpedo boat, Louis, which had been escorting the Gustloff, returned to the scene. Her crew could hear the screaming from miles away, but the small warship could only take so many survivors aboard. Her crew pulled people from the water until they had no more room, and then had to sail away, leaving thousands of voices calling after them in the darkness. Other ships arrived, a minesweeper, a patrol boat. They saved who they could, but there were so many, and the cold worked so quickly. Sailors pulled bodies from the water, hoping to find life, often finding only frozen corpses. When dawn came and the rescue ships could finally see what they were dealing with, the horror was beyond comprehension. The sea was covered with bodies, thousands of them, many frozen in the positions they died in, reaching up for help that never came, holding on to children, clinging to debris. The bodies were so numerous that the ships had to push them aside to move through the water. In total, approximately 1,000 people survived the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, out of more than 10,000. Over 9,000 died. 9,000 souls lost in a single night, in a single ship. To put this in perspective, the Titanic disaster killed about 1,500 people, and it remains the most famous maritime disaster in history. The Gustloff killed 6 times that number. It is the deadliest maritime disaster in history, and yet most people have never heard of it. Those who survived carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Many were children who watched their parents die, mothers who lost their children, young soldiers who survived when their comrades perished. The guilt of surviving when so many didn't haunted them. One survivor, a young boy at the time, later recalled the sound of thousands of people screaming in the water was something he heard in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Another survivor, one of the naval auxiliaries, remembered holding on to a piece of wreckage with several other girls. One by one, they fell silent as hypothermia took them. She survived. They didn't. She never understood why. And what of Commander Marinesco, the man who fired the torpedoes? He returned to base and reported sinking a large enemy vessel. The Soviet Union eventually declared him a hero, awarding him medals for his successful attack. He didn't know the full scale of what he'd done until much later. Some accounts suggest he felt no remorse, seeing it as a legitimate military action in a brutal war. Others suggest he struggled with the knowledge of how many civilians died. The truth is probably more complex than either narrative. Marinesco was a product of his time and his circumstances, a man shaped by war, by the brutality he'd witnessed, by the siege of Leningrad, where millions of his countrymen had starved. To him, this was simply another blow against the enemy that had brought such suffering to his homeland. But here's the thing about war. Both things can be true. The attack on the Gustloff could be legally justified under maritime warfare laws and still be a terrible tragedy. The deaths of 9,000 people could be unavoidable in the context of total war and still be heartbreaking and wrong. So why don't we know about the Wilhelm Gustloff the way we know about the Titanic? The answer is complicated, rooted in the strange politics of post-war Germany and the Cold War. For the Soviet Union, the sinking was a military victory, and they had no incentive to publicize the massive civilian casualties. For East Germany, under Soviet control, the story was suppressed. And for West Germany, the tragedy was part of a larger, uncomfortable narrative about the suffering of German civilians during the war. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, with the full horror of the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities being revealed, there was understandable reluctance to focus on German suffering. The Wilhelm Gustloff disaster didn't fit neatly into the moral narrative of the war. Germans were the aggressors, the perpetrators of unimaginable evil. The victims aboard the Gustloff were still Germans, regardless of their individual guilt or innocence, so the story was largely forgotten. Survivors rarely spoke about it. Historians focused on other aspects of the war. The wreck lies at the bottom of the Baltic, still holding the remains of thousands, but it's a grave rarely visited or remembered. Only in recent decades has the story begun to be told more widely. Books have been written, documentaries made. Survivors have shared their stories before passing away. And slowly, the Wilhelm Gustloff is taking its place in history not as propaganda for any side, but as a reminder of war's terrible cost. What do we learn from the Wilhelm Gustloff? Perhaps we learn that tragedy doesn't choose sides, that the victims of war are often those least responsible for it, that in the chaos and brutality of total war, the line between military necessity and atrocity becomes blurred beyond recognition. The people aboard that ship were casualties of a war started by their government. A war that brought unprecedented evil into the world. But most of them were not Nazis, not soldiers, not war criminals. They were mothers and children, elderly refugees, young people whose only crime was being born in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their deaths don't erase the crimes of Nazi Germany. But neither should those crimes erase the memory of their suffering. The Wilhelm Gustloff lies at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, a tomb for thousands. The water is cold and dark. The bodies are still there, preserved by the ice-cold water, mother and child together. Families huddled in final embrace. Young submariners who never got to fight, all of them frozen in that terrible moment when the ship went down. And perhaps that's the final lesson that we must remember, not to score political points, not to justify or condemn, but simply to remember that these were human beings, just like us, who died terrified and alone in the freezing dark. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their story told. The Wilhelm Gustloff. January 30th, 1945. Over 9,000 souls lost. the deadliest maritime disaster in history, and a tragedy that should never be forgotten.